Well, hi once again, wherever you happen to be. I want to welcome you to Unstoppable Mindset. Today, we get to visit with someone who is known as the book whisperer. How about that? Bridget Cook-Birch writes a lot of stories. She writes a lot of books. She is a storyteller. And I love that about Bridget because I believe that everyone in the world has stories to tell that they can tell. And if they don't necessarily know how to tell the stories themselves, they should seek people who can help them bring the stories out into the open for people to hear. However, if they want to do that, but I think we should never be afraid of telling our stories, whatever they happen to be. So, this is going to be, needless to say, a fun podcast episode to do because stories really is what it's all about. So, with that, Bridget, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you, Michael. I'm so honored to be here, and I cannot wait because I know we're going to have so much fun.
And as I've told a number of people, the only hard and fast rule on this podcast, and it's one I've really only made up in the last few months, but it is we both have to have fun or there's no sense doing it. So, and the other part of that, I suppose, is that listeners have to have fun too. So we'll work on that. We need to make it fun for them. And that's as good as it gets. Well, let's start a little bit by maybe you telling us kind of the story about the early Bridget growing up and all that.
The early Bridget. Oh, that's
The,
scary.
the early Bridget.
Well, the early Bridget was adopted by two extraordinary beings, Dick and Pat Whirling, who were just amazing folks. But I did have three sets of parents by the time I was 6 months old, and I didn't know that unconsciously there were a lot of belief systems like, oh, I can't really trust because the big people will always leave. And so I was pretty fierily independent, but they were very patient with me. And I had some amazing siblings. And I read books like crazy. So I was one of those nerds that was a tomboy whenever I was outside. So I'd play football and climb trees and mountains and, play with rattlesnakes and all the fun stuff. And then when I would go home, I would read every book I could get my hands on. Read out the school library, read out the bookmobile, and my mom would let me go downtown to read out the public library. So I read a lot, and I read a lot of things that many people didn't read until they were college age, but they were important to me. And I was profoundly affected by some of those early stories, like The Diary of Anne Frank and Uncle Tom's Cabin and To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think deep down, it inspired within me to do storytelling that could change the world.
Oop, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Well, cool. So now you got me curious. Tell me about playing with a rattlesnake.
Well, we lived up against the Rocky Mountains, and we were kind of in a deserty area, and
And
there
where
were
was
plenty of.
this?
What's that?
Where were you?
I was in Brigham City, Utah,
In Utah. Okay, great.
of all places. My folks had adopted me from Laramie, Wyoming,
Ah,
and yeah, my folks were from Detroit originally, and they came out so my dad, who was an engineer, could work on the Minuteman missile, and
mm,
um, yeah, so he was a cowboy in all ways, except he wasn't from here. So,
yeah.
yep, he wore the cowboy boots and a belt buckle the size of Texas and a 10-gallon hat, and loved to take us on historical, sites all around the West. So that was
So,
his thing.
so playing with rattlesnakes.
Playing with rattlesnakes, yeah. We used to climb up into the mountains behind our house, and they were full of rattlesnakes.
Hmm.
When I was little, I didn't understand that the baby rattlesnakes were actually more poisonous. I just
Yeah.
thought they were kind of cute. So I would do a little playing around with them until I found out that was not the smartest thing.
Did you ever get bit by one?
You know what? I never did. I think it's because I had a lot of affirmation for nature. I had a lot of peace when I was out in nature, and it seems like I never got bit or scratched or anything else. So I was very blessed. We will tell you that, because there's no way that a ambulance would have made it up the mountain. And
Yeah.
the baby rattlers are actually more poisonous than the adults.
And
So
they're more prone to strike because they don't really have, or at least they haven't yet developed some of the things that they will learn later. But yeah, that is true.
Mhm.
My brother-in-law, so my late wife and her family grew up in Fontana and Rialto in California, also sort of on the lower desert, but lots of things around. And one day, my brother-in-law, Gary, came into the house holding a black widow spider and was showing it off to everybody. And of course, everyone was just freaked out. And so he then took it outside and let it go. But still, he carried this black widow spider into the house fearlessly.
Wow. That I was not as fearless of spiders. I could handle snakes quite a bit, but no spiders. I would just run screaming from spiders.
I have occasionally been in a position where I ended up sitting very close to spiders and didn't know it, but nevertheless, and black widows, among other things, when I was growing up on the desert in Palmdale, that's sort of the high desert, and we had a lot of critters. Of course, my favorites were tortoises, and we had several tortoises come up to our house, and a few decided to live with us for a little while, which was fun. Now, we don't see tortoises anymore, unfortunately.
Oh, that's too bad. But I do know that they don't bite poisonously, but you still have to watch for them biting you. But
Well, if tortoises, there's tortoises and terrapins, which are sometimes called snapping turtles, but tortoises generally won't if you're friendly and don't do anything that you shouldn't do to an animal or anyone else. And one of the things that I did was fed them lettuce and rose petals and occasionally cantaloupe. And even when they weren't eating, if I would put my hand down in front of a tortoise's nose and then slide my finger under the nose, they would stick their head out of the shell to get their neck scratched. They loved it.
Oh,
Yeah, tortoises can be very friendly.
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, they were fun, and we had them a fair amount. And then after growing up and living on the East Coast and coming back to California, we didn't really have so much with tortoises. It's unfortunate. They're more endangered, I think, than they were, but really enjoyed them, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that our kids don't have as easy access to in terms of animals and nature that we once did.
Yeah,
I hope that shifts. I hope that changes.
I do too. I think we also need to learn not to be afraid of so many things. I mean, I would say you be cautious around rattlesnakes, but I think fear is one of the biggest problems that we face because animals can sense when you're afraid. Like people say, if you're caught out somewhere with a bear or with a wolf or even dogs that tend to be aggressive, they're going to be more so if you're showing fear.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what. I had a situation up in Mountain Green. I was a single mom, and I had my sweet husband. Now I was dating. We had so much snow that our dogs were walking out of the fence, and so he put up like a little compound,
Mm-hmm.
and so that they couldn't walk out, and a wolf jumped over the fence to get to the dog food, but then couldn't jump back out.
Oh,
And and I had kids, and I have mama bear instinct when it comes to kids and
yeah.
also to my dog. So I ended up having to open every door in the house that led outside to the other, and then finally opened the sliding glass door so the wolf could go all the way through my house and up through and escape. But that was a pretty harrowing experience.
But it
But like
did.
what you said, we have to be careful about fear because they do sense that, and you know that because of all your dogs, and I'm sure that you've had pretty intense connections with certain animals.
Well, and I value that a great deal. And in fact, later this year, we're publishing a new book called Live Like a Guide Dog, true stories from a blind man and his dogs about being brave, overcoming adversity, and walking in faith. And the idea is that I use lessons that I've learned directly from all of my dogs and my wife's service dog, Fantasia, to deal with fear. And it's the first time I've really started to work to try to teach people that they don't need to be, as I call it, blinded by fear or paralyzed by fear, that you can use fear as a very powerful tool to help you, and that you can use it to help you focus. It isn't to say don't be afraid, but it is a question of how you're afraid and what you do with it. So, yeah, I'd be really concerned about a loose wolf or cat in my yard. But I think that the thing to do is to figure out how to deal with it and try to be peaceful with it. And mostly you can do that unless there's some disease around that, like rabies, that you don't, and they don't have any control over and haven't gotten. But mostly I think we really can learn to be a lot more focused and use fear as a very powerful supportive tool than not. So it is something that'll be out later this year. It's going to be out in August, and I'm looking forward to it. People have seen links to it. Tyndall, the publisher, has already put out some pre-order links and so on, and people are saying very kind things about it. So I hope it'll be as successful as Thunderdog was back in 2011, which was my first book.
I was going to say, I can't wait to read this one because I really enjoyed Thunderdog. I enjoyed the storytelling. I enjoyed the teaching that you did with it. Some of those stories, though, were really something in the stairwell, but also when you were out of the building and you did use fear in a smart way and saved people's lives. Like, that was incredible.
Well, thank you. And I think that that's really what's important. And I realized when the pandemic occurred that I'd been talking about not being afraid for so long, but never really worked to try to help people learn how to control fear. So that's what it's about, helping people. I'm really enjoying being able to have the opportunity to get people to understand we're all better than we think we are.
I would agree with that 1,000%.
So you went off. Did you go to college?
I did. I started off at University of Utah, and then I ended up at Utah State, a little more smaller school that I liked better for just a few different reasons, but especially because I could just be immersed in nature. Like, the canyon was right there in my backyard, and I spent a lot of time up in the canyon. And so I went, I've got a BS and a BA. I took political science and Russian language and all different aspects. I got a couple different minors as well as a couple majors, and loved it. Nothing in English, nothing on writing. So it all had to do really with human relations and international relations. So it was one of those things that I thought I would do until I began writing, and now I incorporate all of it.
So what did you do after college?
Well, I got married, and
that's a full-time job.
Yes. While I was in college, I had a pretty intense near-death experience that solidified my faith in God in a really remarkable way. But it also I've talked to a lot of people who've had near-death experiences and shared death experiences, and it seems like you often come back with a gift, and the gift that I came back with was to be able to see people's stories in an extraordinary way, and I can almost like they'll be telling me a story, and I can see the threads of it and how that could be used for a speech, or how it could be written into a book, and how it could be, even more compelling in the way that it's told. And so I was able to see that. And after college, I was able to start writing and working on some of these stories. So it really turned out to be a boon and a blessing for me.
If you want to, can you tell us a little bit about what happened with your near-death experience?
Yeah. There was a time I was afraid to talk about it because it was so sacred.
Yeah.
But I was also worried that, people might think I was crazy. I hadn't, in the beginning, when it first happened, I was in my early 20s. I was working 3 jobs and going to school and overworking. I got very, very ill and ended up in the hospital and listening to a couple nurses outside in the corridor saying, this girl's not going to make it until morning. And Michael, I don't know how you felt in the tower, except from what you wrote in the book, but the one thing I knew was that I had not fulfilled the measure of my creation. And I had no idea what that was. Like, I was
Yeah.
pretty clueless for a college student. I had big dreams, but I didn't know what the fulfillment of my creation was, but I just knew I hadn't done it yet. And I was so sad that I wasn't going to have that opportunity. And, I had what I would call intercessory prayers. My mother really praying to save my life, and I had other people that were praying, and I had actually 2 figures that filled my room. One I know is an angel, and then one that for me was definitely Jesus Christ. He
Mhm.
was my creator, and he told me that I was being given a second chance at life. And I didn't take any of it for granted. And for the first time in days, I fell into a real deep sleep. My fever came down. And when the nurse came in, she's giving me more intravenous antibiotics because I'd been so sick. Um, and I told her I just had this knowledge. Like I said, you can give me every single one of these antibiotics, but not this one. It's killing me. And she thought I was a fruitcake. She's like, this is the only thing saving your life. We thought you were going to be gone. And I'm like, no, I can have every one of these, but not this one. And fortunately, I had a doctor who had patients who'd had other experiences, and he listened. And he says, well, we might as well take her off this one. She's on the rest of these. And because of that, I was able to walk out of the hospital in the next 24 hours under my own power.
Did
So,
they ever decide that you were allergic to it, or in any
yes,
way did they
I
get an
was
explanation?
deeply allergic to one of those intravenous antibiotics. So
Hmm.
the moment they took me off, I started doing better.
Wow.
So it was pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, my experience from Thunderdog, where I heard God's voice in chapter 10 of Thunderdog, and that was as real as it could get. And
Mhm.
it's one of the things that led me to believe that when one door closes, a window opens, as Alexander Graham Bell once said. And the whole point is that there are things to do. And I didn't even worry about trying to figure out what they were. What I needed to do was to look at opportunities as they came along and do something with them. Of course, the next day after September 11th, so on the 12th, Karen, my wife, said, you ought to really call Guide Dogs for the Blind and tell them what happened, because several of them had visited us in the World Trade Center. So I did. And that
Mm.
led to the director of public information wanting to do a story. And also she said, you're going to get visible on TV, I bet. Where do you want to be first? And I wasn't thinking. So I just said, Larry King Live. And on the 14th of September, we had the first of 5 interviews on Larry King Live. And, the issue is that, again, that led to people starting to call and saying, we really would like you to come on and speak to us and talk to us and tell us what we should learn about September 11th and such things. And so I decided to start doing that. And I realized if I could tell people about what happened and teach them how to move forward from September 11th, if I could teach people more about blindness and what guide dogs are all about and such, then it was worth doing. And that's exactly what I did. And I've been doing it ever since. And then the pandemic came and some things changed, but we continue to move on. And now I'm actually starting to ramp up speaking again and looking for more speaking engagements to help with the income process, because I'm not ready to retire yet and don't have the money to retire yet. So anybody who needs a speaker out there, I'd love to talk with you about it. But the issue is that God gives us the opportunities, and that's really important to deal with. So anyway, I think we really do need to look at opportunities that come. And I really appreciate you talking about what you experienced, because it certainly told you that there's more to do. And I think that for all of us, there's a lot more that we can do if we would but listen and ponder and think about and look at what's happening in our lives to be able to move forward.
I would agree with that 1,000%. And hopefully it doesn't have to take a Mack truck or a near-death experience for us to recognize like what a gift life really is, and what a gift our story is, and how we can serve and support and lift one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that we do focus on the stories and so on. Well, tell me a little bit more about you and stories. You believe that words can change the world and that we all should be telling stories. Talk more about that. And also just about the whole idea of when we're talking about stories, do we really want to talk about the stories that limit us? And do we focus on those, or the stories of possibilities, or does it really even matter?
Oh, I'll tell you what, it does matter. I've seen it over and over again, but I'll tell you a little history of how I discovered that. After my near-death experience, my husband and I moved to Denver, Colorado. And I had the opportunity to work as a PR consultant for a company called Community Learning Centers. And I got to interview high-risk kids, gang youth, and others, but especially the ones who had turned their life around. And I was listening to stories that are so different from how I had grown up that I was fascinated, but I also saw how the stories that we tell ourselves are the most important stories. And I began to see incredible patterns from that. And from that, I thought I would write a fictional book, like a story of forgiveness and redemption, and was even writing this book. And then I had a dream about this book, but it was different than what I had been writing. And in my dream, the book was about, a gang member who had left his gang, had a huge price tag on his head, and in the dream, it was a skinhead. And I didn't know anything about skinheads, because the kids I worked with in Denver were Bloods and Crips and Nuestra Familia and several others, but not any white supremacists. So I had to do all kinds of research and discover their ideology. And then, what was fascinating, Michael, was to have this dream and have to do this research, find out more. And then I come across this guy's website, and he was looking for someone to write his life story that I had been writing from this dream. So to make a long story short, I recognized something guided and divine about stories, at least in terms of where I was finding them, because they continued to find me. And a woman read his book, and she reached out to me and she said, I think if someone could take a story of darkness and create something of hope and healing, it would be you. And then she told me that she was the happy face serial killer's daughter, and asked if I would write her story. And I got to tell you what, it was difficult enough for me to write the skinhead story, but I learned and grew so much. So I wasn't afraid of the story. I just didn't know how I was going to write something of hope and healing about a serial killer's daughter. And then I interviewed her, and I also received a lot of just inspirational downloads on how to write the book. And I will tell you, because we chose to be of service. And I think this is really important for anybody who's choosing to write a book, is who are you writing to and how do you want to reach them? Because when you choose to write a book to be of service, especially in nonfiction, in fiction, there's all different reasons to write: education and entertainment. But in nonfiction, we have different levels that we can go to, and we chose to be of service. And I think because of that, that book did extraordinary things and continues to. It was on Oprah and Dr. Phil and CNN and Good Morning America. And it still remains in the top true crime. And it's transformational true crime because it was not only the victim story, but the rise of Melissa from victim to victor. Now she's a producer in LA. She's been doing tremendous things. I'm her biggest fan, except for her family. And I got to tell you, just that writing that book and seeing what could happen with a story that could change the world, it changed me. And it made me more open to seeing how one person could change the world. And I got to write, my next story was of a woman who was the 19th wife of 65 women right here in our country. And she got married to the prophet of the FLDS Church, which was an extreme organization. And they were trafficking children in the name of God. And there were a lot of good and innocent people in that group. And then there were nefarious leaders. But I saw the power of this one woman, Rebecca Musser, to help dismantle an organized crime unit in the name of God. And she put Warren Jeffs behind bars for life plus 20 years. And it wasn't all her. There was a huge team. And there was these amazing, like attorneys and Texas Rangers and AG's office members, down in Texas. And they all worked together along with other witnesses. But she was a primary player. And what was really cool about that, Michael, I'll tell you, is Warren Jeffs had outlawed the color red because that was supposed to be the color that Christ would wear when he came again. And so none of his people were allowed to have red cars or red toys or red clothing. And every time that Rebecca testified, more than 20 times in a court of law, she came sashaying in some sort of red, which I loved because it was her way of telling this man who said he would break her, that that he did not break her. And it was really lovely. But the last time she went to testify, she had to face Warren Jeffs on her own because he had fired his attorneys. And I know that she was petrified on the inside, but she comes into court and she's wearing this beautiful red suit, and she turns around to be sworn in and sees the galley. And I'll never forget because I was sitting in the galley watching her, and the whole galley was filled with red ties on the Texas Rangers and red flowers in women's hair and, red dresses. And I witnessed firsthand the power of one woman to change the world again. And ever since then, I've just been recognizing more and more things about story. And I've written some really incredible books since then. But I wanted to share a quote with you because you asked about the stories that we tell ourselves. And another author that I love, he was a professor, Harold Goddard. And he said, the destiny of the world is determined less by the battles lost and won than by the stories it loves and believes in. And my question to the world is, so are you going to let those stories that you love and believe in be stories of limitation or of possibility? And I've been able to see what happens when someone says, all right, I'm going to begin to tell myself stories of possibility.
How true. And so eloquently said. And the issue is that we limit ourselves. I've told people on this podcast a number of times that I used to always say to myself, I'm my own worst critic when I'm thinking about things. And I realized over the last year, wrong thing to say. We need to get out of the negative mindset so much in most everything that we do. And I now say I'm my own best teacher because in reality, I'm the only one who can teach me things. People can offer and give information, but I'm my own best teacher. And I should approach everything that way. And I think more of us should really approach life from a learning and an adventure standpoint, because life really is an adventure, and it's there to give us the opportunity to learn if we, but we'll do it.
I would agree 1,000%. It is an adventure, and I think a lot of us will stay in this just barely getting by, scraping by, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, that we hold ourselves in a box and we're afraid to venture out. In the last few years, like I love that you realized that people needed a way to overcome fear and to really be able to face it and lean into it. And the last several years in our country, we've just been facing some things that have made fear come straight up in our face.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a reason for that. I think all things happen for a reason, and it's time for humanity to be able to move beyond fear and to use it as a tool, as you mentioned, but also as a stepping stone to so many greater things, including, not having to tear one another down.
Mm-hmm.
We've been very territorial, and some of that is, thousands of years in our DNA of creating an us versus them, so we can protect ourselves. And we've held a lot of judgment for others, but there's this unique and beautiful thing that happens when we let down our walls. And yeah, we still need to discern. We need to, if somebody tells us who they are, we need to believe them. But I also think there's so much good in people. And if we can begin to lift one another up, all the boats rise together, that humanity has some really exciting things in store.
We have been experiencing in so many ways from some of our political leaders, and I sort of put leaders in quotation marks, but we've been seeing so much fear. And the other thing is that a lot of people say, well, I trust what this guy says. I trust what that guy says. And my response is, why do you trust them? Well, because he talks to me. He says what I want to hear. Again, whoever it is that they're talking about. And my response is, and where it goes back to the whole issue of fear, is how much of it do you verify? And it doesn't matter what political side you're on. How much of it do you really think about and analyze and really look at what one person or everyone is saying? Right now, I'm in California. We have the one of the Senate races going on, and there are two major Democrats running, and one is Adam Schiff, who was involved in, of course, the whole issue of the investigation of January 6th. And the other one is a woman named Katie Porter. And Adam Schiff's commercials oftentimes talk about, well, they play segments of speeches and they do other things, and they talk about his accomplishments. And Katie Porter talks about she doesn't take political PAC money or federal or large corporate PAC money and other things like that. And when I heard a few of the commercials on both sides, I step back and I say, what has this person really done? Why do I want to vote for this person just because they don't take PAC money? Or what have they accomplished? What have they done to show me that they're truly going to be able to make our world better than it is? And I think that it's my obligation as a voter to really look at that. And again, it doesn't matter whether it is in the Democratic side or the Republican side. We really have to analyze. And if we do that, we won't be nearly as fearful of so many things as we are today.
I would agree with that. I love what you have to say about that, because a lot of things have to do with tearing one another down, or like you said, the fear based. But what is someone's track record in building something, in creating something? So that's a very good point, Michael.
Well, I think that we really need to look at more than just listening to words. It's our job to think about, to synthesize, to internalize, and come up with answers based on everything rather than relying on what some people say. I love all all these conspiracy theorists all over the place are so amazing. And I don't know what to say other than prove it. and
Right.
and
Well,
that's
one
really what
thing
it comes
we
down
we
to.
know is that they know how to use the power of story. They just happen to be using it to tear people down. And if we're not careful, we can get sucked into a rabbit hole. And I love what you said, like more than words, what are they doing? But also, I think it's important for us to do our own research, not believe something just because everybody else says it. In fact, Michael, I had a funny experience last year, the year before, when some of these conspiracy theories were really hitting some high points, and there was a lot going on in terms of human trafficking and some of these world power theories on that. And we found out some of these were true in terms of some high profile celebrities that got in trouble
Mm-hmm.
when some things were going down. But it was interesting because I found out that I was on a hit list that was going out to many people that were going down these rabbit holes of conspiracy theories. And I was grateful that they were trying to do the work, but they accidentally put me on the other sheet. Like, here's the enemies that we're going to go after. And then here are those people that actually will do the journalism and the research, and they'll help to bring it down. And I was supposed to be on the journalism and research and writing books that will help to bring down some of these monolithic crime units. And I ended up being accidentally put on the other list. And luckily, a friend of mine said, whoa, wait a minute, before they published the list. And she said she's actually supposed to be on the other list. But I thought, how quickly my reputation could have been ruined in
Yeah.
a split second. And that is happening all across the United States, all across the world. And so that's why we have to stand for our own stories, because sometimes we're going to be put on the wrong list, or someone's going to hate something that we have to say. But I also think it's really important for us to take a stand for something.
Yeah.
We're really good at taking stands against things, but what are we good at taking a stand for?
Yeah. So tell me, what do you think the deepest need is that humans have, and what do stories have to do with it?
Hmm. I
There's a
honestly,
deep question.
it is a deep question, but it's cool because I get to see it every day. So I'm glad that you asked that. The deepest need that I see humans need is for significance. They need to know that they're here for a reason, that they're wanted, that they're needed, that they're seen and heard and valued by someone. And stories can go such a long way in doing this. It has to start inside of us, because whatever stories we're telling ourselves, we write the script for other people to treat us that way. I see that over and over as well. But then there's also, how do I present myself and my stories out in the world? Doesn't mean that everybody has to write a book or be a best-selling author, but every day we tell stories. We tell stories to ourselves, we tell stories to our spouses, we tell stories to our bosses and the people that are in our chain of command or our associates. We tell stories to the grocery clerk, and and stories are really remarkable in their power. We were just talking about conspiracy theories, and I think we're seeing some huge things happening the last couple of years in Russia too. How
Yeah.
Russia was able, just like we've seen in the last several world wars and other altercations, where propaganda could sway an entire nation
Mm-hmm.
to go up against their neighbor, who a lot of them were family members, and to believe lies about that neighboring nation. And so stories are relevant. They are important. Ever since we were around the campfire, as early education of humans took place in the storytelling. at that point. We learned our roles, our responsibilities, what was possible, what we believed was impossible. And the beautiful thing is that we continue to show that we're way beyond what we once thought was impossible. And now the question is, what are we going to do with it? But stories are vital to humankind.
And we should appreciate them and love them, um, and use them to allow us to teach ourselves more things. You talked earlier about fiction isn't so much about service, and I'm not totally sure I would say that. I think that, yeah, fiction is intended to entertain. So is a lot of nonfiction, but the issue is, I think of books like the Harry Potter series, which really are so inspirational and offer so many lessons that all of us can use. And the reality is, some people say, well, yeah, it's fiction. Well, really? So what? How many times do we hear about people who have done so many things that no one thought they or anyone can do? And I mean, one of my favorite stories is, of course, it was said for many years that no one could break the 4-minute mile. You would die before you could break the 4-minute mile, until Roger Bannister did it in 1956, I think it was, or 57. And then everybody started to do it. But people said that he would die before he would be able to do that. And it was a medical impossibility. But the reality is, he believed that he could, and he did.
I agree. And how beautiful that all of a sudden he broke that entire barrier of beliefs for people. And I love that you mentioned Harry Potter. I love J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, I do too.
And I love what she's created, and she's done what a lot of people considered impossible. A single mom with a little baby and that she had to care for, and she's writing on cocktail napkins, on the train rides and doing things. And she did something so extraordinary and reinvigorated an entire world of children and adults to want to read again. And how beautiful that is. And you're right, there's so many lessons and other things. And she does more than entertain, and I would agree with that. I also just want to share too that our world has changed quite a bit, in which the literature for young people doesn't include as many of those profound elements of lessons and morals and friendships and what do we do. There's a lot of darker elements to our entertainment for young people. And the one thing that I would caution in that is, I can't tell you how many people, who I've helped with their stories and write their books and other things, and they were heavily influenced by the media of that time and that day. And so, it's one of those things where I still think it's important for writers to be able to influence young people towards believing in themselves, believing in possibilities, and to believe that light can be greater than the darkness. I think we all need that right now.
I love Stephen King. I think he's a very creative writer, but I don't like to read nearly as much of the dark stuff as I used to. But I also think that he, like so many people, demonstrates a lot of creativity, especially in some of his earlier books, in a lot of different ways. And so I can appreciate that. And I think that any good author is one that you have to look just beyond the words to what's going on in the story, what kind of creative things that they bring to it. And he clearly is a good storyteller.
Mm-hmm. He's extremely talented.
Yeah.
He's
Jealous as I am.
Off the charts talented, that's for sure.
Jealous as I am. And, and then there are others. Go to the Westerns, Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey. Now, Zane Grey, of course, a long time ago, but one of the neat things about Zane Grey was, and is with his stories, he's so descriptive. He draws you in and makes you feel like you're in the country he's writing about. And he talks so much about the land and the country that he makes you feel you're there, which is so cool.
Oh, that's neat. You know what? I've not read a lot of Zane Grey. I think only one or two of his back in the day, but I read a lot of Louis L'Amour.
Yeah, I
I'll
still
have to add Zane Grey to my readers list.
I keep looking every so often in case I find that there's a Louis L'Amour book I haven't read because I really enjoy his writing. And yeah, a lot of them are all the same sort of basic plot, and it's the but that's the difference. And his stories are also good.
Yeah, and it's interesting about Zane Grey too, finding out that he was a dentist. It always made
Yeah.
me wonder, like, when he was working in people's mouths, was he crafting plots and storylines and other things? I think
And
that's
telling
smart.
stories.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned once that Warren Buffett has an interesting quote that you think is extremely valuable. What is that?
Well, Warren Buffett, as most people know, has been this incredibly influential business leader,
Talk about being a bright and creative guy.
a bright and creative guy who's worth so much more than any of us can, not any of us, but many of us can conceptualize. And one of the things he's famous for teaching is, if you want to be worth several times more in your lifetime, learn how to express yourself on paper and in person. So he truly believed in the power of story. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we've seen that through some of the smartest CEOs of our generation have been the creative storytellers. The ones who recognize the power of story and then were able to put that together. Apple is one of those fabulous examples of when they would fail and then when they could succeed spectacularly is when the storytelling got as good as the technology, and
Mm-hmm.
the storytelling being even better than the technology for that particular year, but they've been able to shine because of it.
Well, when Steve Jobs really started expressing his vision and talking about what a piece of technology should do and could do and motivated people to then make it happen,
Mhm.
that's so important, I think, in an organization.
I think so too. I think so too. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that. And sometimes we see when some of these leaders fail, they tell too big of a story and they can't manage the expectations, or they fall flat in the storytelling, or they hurt someone in the storytelling, which actually ends up not doing them good in the long run. But I think what's important is, can you be inspiring? Can you motivate? And can you be your word when you're choosing to use those stories for a greater good?
Another thing that's coming up, and I was going to call it the elephant in the room, but that's not fair to it. It's not fair to do that. But what about the whole issue of AI and chat GPT and so on? Where do you see that fits into the world today and going forward?
Well, that's a fascinating question. And you know who asks me this the most are some of the young people when I'm on their podcast. And I sound so old, like a grandma, and I am grandma. I'm a Mimi. But these young podcasters, they want to know too. Like, hey, you've been around the block. What do you think about AI? And I'm going to tell you something. There are some people who are completely against it, and they feel like we're going to hell in a handbasket really quickly because of AI. And then there are those who are saying, "Hey, this is the end all be all, and we shouldn't and couldn't be doing anything without it." And I'm going to tell you, I'm in the middle. I'm going to tell you why. The reason I think that there is merit to AI is that there's certain things that it's going to do so much more quickly for us. It's going to help us with ideas. And in terms of writing, it's going to help us edit more quickly so we can communicate better. Where we run into trouble is if we're asking AI to be our brain, to be our creativity, to be our thinker. And sometimes people get really nervous about that because they think kids will use AI and that they won't think on their own. But I will tell you this, the kids I've been seeing, even the young ones with AI, it sparks their imagination greater. They're asking smarter questions. They're wanting to see more. They're coming alive with a fire of creativity. They're not relegated to, oh, you couldn't spell a word to save your life. Well, this will spell the word for me, but I want to tell this story and I want the graphics to look this way and I want to create a movie, and it enables the human imagination to take off. All I would say is don't let it be your brain.
I had the honor to talk with someone a couple of weeks ago, a gentleman named Glenn Gow, who's a e-business coach and supports AI a great deal. He would agree with you and me, by the way. I believe the same. And one of the things that he said was that he went to a company who wanted his coaching, and they talked about AI. And one day the CEO called his major people together and said, "Take the day and study AI, and then come back tomorrow." I think it was the next day, and tell us how we should incorporate AI in one way or another, Chat GPT or whatever, into our business. And the creative, incredible ideas that people came back with the next day totally astounded the CEO. And they put things in place and it improved the company a great deal, because the idea still is it shouldn't be the job of artificial intelligence, I think, no matter how advanced it gets, to be the end all and be all, as you said. It is still something where I think there is a component of us that we're not going to be able to create in the near future. Dr. Ray Kurzweil would say we'll join the human brain with a computer, and that will change all that. I'm not convinced of that, and I know Ray. I used to work for him. I think that the reality is that artificial intelligence is a tool, and I think in the classroom, if teachers embrace it correctly, what they will do if they think that students are starting to really use it to create their papers is teachers will get more creative and say, "Okay, class, everyone's turned in their papers. Now I'm going to call on each of you, and you have a minute and a half to defend your paper in front of the whole class." I mean, there are ways to deal with it to make sure that the students are really still doing what they should do. And I've used Chat GPT to help compose some things that I've worked on. And for me, I get all that I can, I think, from the artificial intelligence system. And then I turn it into my own work by changing things, adding things that AI didn't catch. And I know making a much better article because I started using something else to help me. And I just view it as a collaborative effort, a team, and AI as part of the team.
And sometimes it can provide a really valuable framework for the imagination to take fire. So I'm with you on that. I think that there's a lot of beautiful things it can be used for.
And I think over time we'll realize that it's such a big hot issue right now. But the internet was a big hot issue, and we still have the dark web today, and it's there with us. But people, by and large, have now accepted the value of the internet and what it can bring. I have always believed it's a wonderful treasure trove of information. So I have a lot of fun exploring the internet. Haven't ever been to the dark web, don't know where it is. And if I ever found it and I discovered it was inaccessible, I'd see who I could go off and sue because they didn't make it accessible. But that's another story. That's my conspiracy for the day.
That's your conspiracy for the day. I've hired private detectives to go on the dark web to research situations for safety for my authors. But that's as far as I've gone.
I have no idea how to get to the dark web, or, I mean, I can conceptually, intellectually understand the process, but would have no idea where to go to find it. So you'll have to tell me when we're done here. I've always been curious, but I hear what you're saying. And the reality is that the internet and AI are two tools that can enhance what we do so much. And I think people will eventually recognize that and will become better for it.
I think so too. And again, I just think we have to have faith in each other, in humankind, and in our own imagination.
Yeah. We just have to work on it, and we have to recognize and think it through and then take action. And we can learn to do that very well. I love to tell people the best thing I think anyone could do is to take time at the end of the day. And while you're falling asleep, think about what happened that day. Think about what worked, what didn't work. And even what worked, what could you do better with it? I never talk about failure. So the things that didn't work aren't failures. It's a learning experience, and we grow from it. And I think we can do that. But I think that it's what we have to do to become better than we are. And we can do that every single day, which is, for me, such a cool idea and what I like to do. Well, what are some of the problems that you think exist in the world today that we as individuals can change? How's that for a general question for you?
Question, Michael. Well, honestly, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty wonderful. I remember sometimes that I have felt helpless in the world when something has happened, particularly like in terms of humankind, right? Sometimes there was a crime committed and I felt helpless. Sometimes there was like a school shooting and I felt helpless. A world disaster and I felt helpless and I wanted to serve and do something in some capacity. And then I get asked to write a story or I get asked to help an author. And it's just like God brings me a story to show, for one thing, for me to let down my judgments and to see that there are so many solutions out there. So one of the things I'll just say is that we talk about conspiracy theories. There is an author that I'm working with who has this tremendous story, and I can't tell you all about it today, but I'll be singing his praises to high heaven in a few months. But what I will tell you is he had to come across one of the roughest and nefarious conspiracy theorists of our time. And he learned to own his voice. And he learned to be able to tell the truth in a really beautiful, extraordinary way. And part of that was creating something that made other conspiracy theorists think twice before they were going to tell lies about individuals or families just for their own agenda or to make their own money. That's powerful. You know, when someone can use their own personal story to bring down a conspiracy theorist who's making millions of dollars based on those conspiracies, that tells you, again, the power of one person. I'm seeing world leaders do extraordinary things in terms of how do we lift one another on the planet? How do we take care of our planet? As you know, nature is so important. Animals are so important. How are we going to take care of that? I love that you are one of those authors who, in terms of accessibility and making sure that people are being taken care of in all their forms, you're one that brings solutions. So I love that. Can I share a story?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So one of the things we've been facing as we've been discussing is the last several years, this predilection for humankind to tear down one another in our fear. And I had the opportunity to work with an extraordinary person. His name is Gary Lee Price. And he faced a lot of that tearing down when he was a child. He had a mother and stepfather who he lost through murder-suicide on an army base in Mannheim, Germany. And he and his baby brother were shipped from the frying pan back into a couple of horrific situations. And Gary himself faced all kinds of abuse, the worst kinds of abuse, and really a slavery in his own house. And part of it was because the adults were working nights and they didn't know. that he was being tortured and abused. And instead of becoming a horrific, violent, bitter person, Gary found God and he found art. And he became a very famous painter in his area by the time he was in high school. But it was when he found this three-dimensional miracle called clay
Mm.
that all of a sudden his imagination took flight, literally. And he's, to this day, created thousands of sculptures that lift humankind. And they're in corporate offices and arboretums and churches and outside the Vatican and in the Hong Kong Library. Like, they are all over. But in terms of solving human problems or inspiring our solving of problems, Gary was asked to create a symbol that was inspired by Dr. Viktor Frankl. And you know
Mm.
who that is, right?
Yes.
So he had survived 4 Nazi concentration camps in 3 years, and he lost his entire family to the gas chambers and to illness. And he got out and he wrote this extraordinary book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, eventually, and also when he would teach in the United States, he would say, you know, in the United States, it's wonderful that you have the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. And he said, but in Vienna, we learned that liberty itself is not the only answer. You need to have responsibility, because without responsibility, there is no liberty. And, you know, he'd seen irresponsibility and anarchy and dictatorship and
Yeah.
annihilation. And so, anyway, Dr. Stephen Covey thought, wouldn't it be awesome to honor Dr. Frankl with creating a symbol of the Statue of Responsibility? And Gary created this symbol. And after everything he'd been through as a child, when he was thinking, what is a symbol that can inspire all of humankind? And it was the symbol of one hand reaching down to grasp another, to lift it up. And he says, sometimes we're the hand reaching down, and sometimes we're the hand reaching up. And
Mhm.
here's the cool thing, Michael, in our lifetime, in fact, very soon from now, we will be seeing the beginning of the building of the Statue of Responsibility, and it will be 305 feet tall to match the Statue of Liberty. And it will have interactive museums and discussions for children, like, what does responsibility mean? And there's many other things, but this is one of the ways that stories can change the world for the better, and symbols and art and imagination can lift us rather than destroy us.
And it should be that way. Well, tell me, you've written a number of books that have become bestsellers. How does that happen that they become bestsellers?
Well, it can happen a number of different ways, especially you've probably noticed, but publishing has changed tremendously over the last 20 years.
Yes.
And there used to be a time when traditional publishing was pretty much the only way. And there were a few people who wrote books, and they would do their best to get it out there. And if it was accepted by traditional publishing, it was such a glorious thing. But most people only sold between 250 and 300 books in their lifetime. And then we had the advent of Amazon. And then we had the advent of self-publishing, which I'm not going chronological. Self-publishing has
Right.
been around for a long time. Vanity Press also for a long time. And also indie publishing, which helps to create every service you would get through traditional publishing, but you get to keep your own intellectual property and most of your proceeds rather than the lion's share going to traditional. And I've had the luxury and pleasure of being able to work on all sides of that. Like, my first 2 books were published through a small publisher who took a chance. And Shattered Silence, when it was on Oprah, became their #1 bestseller for 2 years in a row. So it was a win for them, and it was a huge win for me. And then my third book, when it came out, we had a New York agent, and she negotiated an incredible deal with Hachette and Grand Central Publishing, which was one of their publishing labels underneath Hachette. So one of the largest publishers in the entire world. And I got to see all the beautiful machinations that New York publishing offers, all the services, all the wonders of that, and the credibility that goes along with it. And also since that time, I've also been able to help people with national and international bestsellers on Amazon. And that's a different ballgame. It's different than a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And it has to do with there's two aspects of it. Is number one, making sure that all the information is set up well and that you're in the right categories and that you're being seen and being visible. And then the other part of the strategy is that, you get everyone that's in your inner circle and anyone and everybody in your family and friends and everything else to purchase your book on the same day, close to the same time, because it raises your visibility in the ranks, and you want to become a hot new bestseller on Amazon. You want other people's eyes to be able to see it. And if you're lucky enough to have an international team, then you can often become an international bestseller and be seen in countries like France and Australia and Canada and other things. So it can be a game, and you've got to be careful, because in every industry there's scammers.
Yeah.
And in terms of indie publishing and self-publishing and traditional publishing, there are scammers out there, and you've got to watch it. But it's a smart and fun business part of the business strategy in terms of pre-launch, launch, and post-launch. You just need to make sure that you're working with reputable people who care about the longevity of your book, not just a flash in the pan, but something that's going to serve people and have a ripple effect. You hope for 50 years from now, right? And that someone halfway across the world can be absolutely inspired by your book.
Yeah. And whenever I get comments from people, even today, some 13 years later, and I think that will continue to happen, but who say, I read your book, and it's such a joy to hear that I'm able to help inspire people and show them something, because it's about them. It's not about me. And that's really the way it should be. Well, last question for you. What's one thing that you would advise someone who wants to write a book for the first time and maybe is a little bit reluctant to do it?
So, fiction or nonfiction?
Yes.
Okay. I usually have a little different answer, but I will tell you this: for whoever your main character is. So if it's nonfiction, that main character is going to be you. If it's fiction, you will have an aspect of yourself in that character. But I highly recommend that you put together a chronological timeline, because every good story has backstory, and then it has the current story, and then it also has where you're taking the reader in the journey that you're taking them on. And a lot of times when we're thinking of stories or writing about our own stories, we'll take down little bits and pieces, but we don't always remember the order in which they happened or why we reacted a certain way or certain things happened. When we put together a chronology for our character, there's so much magic that happens. You see patterns of story, like, oh, we had this conversation and then he said this and I reacted this way. And then I got this phone call and I said yes. And all of a sudden we realize, wow, there were 5 things that raised the stakes, that built up the tension, that created a change in the decision and a commitment to that change, or whatever it might be. And we understand ourselves better, or we understand our characters better, but we can also tell a much better story to our readers.
Makes perfect sense. And as I think back on Thunderdog, although I didn't up front specifically thinking the way you're talking about. That is the way the book actually ended up not only being written, but I had the tools that really did go in chronological order. So I was guided to do it, I guess, but it was a lot of fun. And certainly now with the new book, Live Like a Guide Dog, we definitely spent a lot of time on making sure that that we did things in a very chronological way and looked at it a lot of times, kept going back over it to make sure that we were making it everything that it could be. So I hope it comes out and is a good book.
Beautiful. Well, knowing you, Michael, and your level of storytelling and what you've been able to do with story since Thunderdog and your podcast, I can't wait to read this one.
I only wish that I was the guy who first said a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But okay.
I know.
Someone else took it first. Someone else took it first.
Can we just take that over and maybe have the royalties that come from that?
Sure. And we'll spread a conspiracy that it was really us and not them.
There you go.
Forget 20th century Fox. Well, Bridget, I want to thank you for being here. If people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Well, thanks for asking. I welcome people to reach out to me, and I love to hear people's stories. So you can find me on yourinspiredstory.com. That's yourinspiredstory.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, Bridget Cook-Birch, the book whisperer, and on LinkedIn as well. And I'm just really looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, great. I hope people will reach out and take time to interact with you. And I think it will be a good thing if they do it. So I want to thank you for being here. And I want to thank you all for listening in wherever you are. Really appreciate it. I hope that if you have any thoughts about today's episode and all the things we've talked about, you will reach out to me and let me know. You can reach me at Michael, MichaelHi, Michael H.I. at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or you can go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Michael Hingson is MichaelHingson, all one word, .com/podcast. Wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star review. We really value that. We really appreciate it. And I hope that you liked it well enough and you liked what we had to say well enough today to do that. So definitely, wherever you are, hope that you enjoyed what you heard today and that you'll be back again next time to listen to Unstoppable Mindset. And Bridget, one last time, I want to thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you.